This video is going to review the laws of heredity that we've been seeing in the textbook. To get started, it's always a good idea to use your notebook and write down your notes. We'll be going over these three ideas so you can make this chart and it'll be helpful to write down the information, organize it. We're going to go over the law of segregation, the law of independent assortment, and the law of dominance. The law of segregation was written by Mendel without even knowing what chromosomes were, not knowing what was inside of cells, not knowing anything about DNA, but he figured this one out. The law of segregation basically states that two alleles for each trait separate during meiosis. We saw this in meiosis when we looked at the formation of sperm and egg. We know that there's two copies of genetics, two copies of every chromosome. In humans, there are a total of 46 chromosomes. 23 came from mom and 23 came from dad. Well, in the process of meiosis, they have to be reduced by 1/2. Instead of being a 2N diploid organism in a normal somatic cell, we have to reduce those numbers by 1/2, creating a haploid cell. And Mendel figured this out without even knowing anything about the chromosomes. As you can see in the diagram, here we have a yellow pea plant, right, which is dominant, 2 capital Y's for its genotype, meaning it's dominant, and 2 lowercase y's for a green pea plant. We're starting out with the beginnings of a monohybrid cross to make all hybrids, right? In the end, we will have hybrids. And the reasoning for that is because each parent can only contribute one of their 2 alleles. And in this case, both the alleles in the yellow pea plant are the same, and the alleles in the green plant are the same because they are what we call pure breeds. Right? They don't have some underlying hidden trait that they can pass on. They are not carriers for the other trait, so they are pure breeds. And when you look at the gametes, of course we're talking about plants, they're hermaphrodites. They don't have male or female sex. A single plant has both organs, male and female. Here you can see they separate, right? No longer are they a genotype of big Y, but they've separated out. And you can produce pollen or eggs, pollen being the male sex cells that are produced by the flower, and then little y. And what Mendel was able to do was go through and select a yellow pea plant, grab the pollen from it, and put it on the female parts of a green plant, and then vice versa. Take the pollen from a green plant and put it on the female parts of a female part of a flower. And what you end up with, because you're only going to be able to have pollen with one or the other allele depending on which plant you're using, all of the resulting zygotes are going to be hybrids. They'll be carriers for that particular green trait, even though it's not expressed, right? Because the green is hidden, and you can't actually find any of that particular color in the what we call F1 generation. Now, when we look at that, when we think about the law of segregation, right, we're talking about DNA, and we know that it's talking about proteins. Mendel didn't know anything about this, but the law of segregation states that the alleles separate during meiosis. Very key. The next big idea is the law of independent assortment. So far, in all the examples that we've gone through, have been monohybrid crosses, or crosses where we look at just one allele. Maybe it's you'll see other crosses we go through that aren't necessarily monohybrid crosses. But in this case, we talk about a law of independent assortment. We're talking about the possible multiple genes, not the same gene, but different genes, and they might do different things. One way you can test for this is something called a dihybrid cross. So instead of just looking at one trait, we've seen multiple cases where we looked at one trait. Now you can start looking at more than one, a di being 2. You look at 2 traits in a dihybrid cross. So the law of independent assortment states that a random distribution of alleles occurs during gamete formation. Genes separate on chromosomes, sort independently during meiosis. What this tells us is that one trait is not connected to another one because they are found on different chromosomes. So in the example we have here, we have pea plants, and we saw in previous examples that they can be yellow, dominant, green, recessive, but we can also look at whether they are round or wrinkled. Capital R is for round, and little r is wrinkled, a recessive trait. And because we're looking at two traits at the exact same time, you can see that there's the possible allele gametes. This top sex cell would have the allele for green and round. The second one down would have the allele yellow and wrinkled. The third one down would be green and round. And the last one would have both recessive traits, green and wrinkled. Now there are some traits that are linked directly together because they're really close, or they're found on the same chromosome, and we learned about crossing over and things like that. The further genes are on a chromosome, the more likely that they can be separated and independently assorted. But if they're really close, if their address on the chromosome is really close, then they can be linked together. Very rare, but there could be linkage. And that linkage could be due to being on a sex chromosome. We know that color blindness is directly related to a gene found on the X chromosomes, and because X's, boys only get one X chromosome, means that they're more likely to get that trait. And we'll talk more about linkage later on. But the law of independent assortment is pretty strong and shows that one trait is not linked to the other. And we can see that, right? In these results, you can be green and wrinkled, you can be round and green, you can be round and yellow, right? There's all kinds of different combinations that are possible because of this independent assortment. The law of dominance explains that if an offspring receives a dominant and recessive allele, only the dominant can be seen. When we're talking about this, we're talking about phenotypes, the outward appearance that we can see. In this case, we have two parents, one that's phenotype is yellow, another that is green. And we know they're pure breeding. And so we know their outward appearance is yellow and green. Well, pure breeding tells us that they have no underlying genetics that makes them a hybrid. So that means that the yellow pea, and we know it's dominant, has to be capital Y, and the green pea has to be lowercase y, lowercase y. Pure breeding means that they're homozygous dominant. When you cross them in a monohybrid cross, you get all individuals that are yellow. They do not show the recessive trait. These are the hybrids. They would be the genotype big Y, little y, and they're all yellow as their phenotype. This pattern of inheritance is what we call complete dominance. You will see other situations where this rule may not apply, and we will explain that in further lessons and videos.